This is the Innerspace Explorer podcast where we dive deep into the inner worlds of fictional characters and real people and discover the universal truths that connect us all. Today, I am finally going to be doing a recording talking about a show that has been my favorite for the longest time. And this is Gilmore Girls, and I will get into why it has been my favorite show for a very long time, or one of my favorite shows, I should say. But we're really going to dive deep into some of the characters of Gilmore Girls and specifically address this idea of generational trauma. So let me get into why I have enjoyed Gilmore Girls as much as I have. For me, there are certain shows that are like my comfort shows, and these are shows that I watch maybe, if I'm home and I'm not feeling well, or if I'm feeling a bit low and I just want something that just soothes me. Gilmore Girls is one of those shows for me, and the reason for that is because of, I guess, the time of my life. When I got into Gilmore Girls, or the first time that I watched it, I was a teenager. And so there's just something that's very nostalgic to me about the show, especially because Rory and I happen to be around the same age, if not exactly the same age. And so it felt when I was watching the show like I was looking at myself, and comparing and contrasting our experiences. And there were some things that I could really relate to, and there were some things that I couldn't relate to. So I'll just give like a brief overview, because maybe you're here and you've never watched Gilmore Girls and you're just like, what the hell, who is Rory? So let me just give a brief synopsis of what the show is about. So in Gilmore Girls, we're introduced to these two central characters, and that is Lorelai Gilmore and Rory Gilmore. They are mother and daughter, and although that's not very clear from the very beginning in terms of the pilot, especially the first scene, the way Rory is introduced to us, it's not like she's actually a 16-year-old girl, but we later learn very quickly that Rory is 16 years old and Lorelai is 32 years old, which means that Lorelai had Rory when she was 16 years old. And so there's also that contrast of the show beginning at the age that Rory is when Lorelai, let me tell you, these R's and L's are a struggle for my Kikuyu tongue, but I will get through this. I guess part of the interesting contrast of the show is the fact that when we meet them in season 1, Rory is the same age that Lorelai was when she had Rory. Please, I need congratulations. I need some applause for surviving that. This is going to be an interesting experience for my tongue. The relationship between Lorelai and Rory is the central theme in the entire show. They have a very interesting kind of, it's almost like a sibling, sister, mother-daughter, sometimes with Rory taking on the parenting role. It's like a hybrid of so many different relationships, and throughout the show they also call each other best friends. It's a very unique relationship that they have, and we spend the entire show getting to see different sides of it. When they have conflict, when they're getting along, when Rory is trying to find her independence, when Lorelai is also growing up in her own ways. But for me, as much as Gilmore Girls focuses on these two characters, I cannot talk about Gilmore Girls without including Emily Gilmore, who is the mother of Lorelai Gilmore, because she is also quite a central character. And when we're introduced to her in the beginning, she doesn't feel like she's going to be such an important character. But as the series goes on, you really start to see her influence in so many different ways on Lorelai's development, on her choices, on her personality, and you also see her influence also grow when it comes to Rory. So that's basically the synopsis of the show. We follow them as Rory goes through high school, goes into college, and becomes an adult. At the end of the show, which is 7 seasons, we end when Rory has just graduated college. But there was also a revival where they had now the storyline of Rory in her adult years. And I believe at that point she was 32, which again, we get to contrast her being 32 compared to the way Lorelai was when the initial series began at season 1. And I feel like the revival, I have so many things to say about the revival because there's so many things that I loved about it. There's so many things that were just like, there were storylines that I was just like, this feels kind of like forced. But it's also interesting. Sorry, my neighbor, if you hear a child in the background, that is my neighbor. The show is, especially when it came to the revival, was the fact that the creator, who is Amy Sherman Palladino, had a very specific way that she wanted Gilmore Girls to end. And so in the revival, it was sort of like making up for that, because in season 7, towards the end of season 6, I believe there was a bit of a conflict between Amy, who was the creator of Gilmore Girls, and the network. So Amy and the network did not get to a point of agreement, and she and her husband, who were the creators and producers of this show, as well as the main story writers of the show, they ended up leaving in season 7. I feel like I will have a few videos that I want to do around Gilmore Girls, and specifically around the main 3 characters. I feel like what I'll do is have a breakdown for each of the characters. In this video, I just kind of wanted to talk about the general theme of generational trauma, because this isn't something that I even recognized the first few times, because I've watched that show many times. But the first few times that I watched it, I didn't recognize this particular theme. I think as an adult and having done the inner work, that's when I started to really see this theme, and I was like, oh my God, it was so blatant. How did I not notice this? So I will talk a bit about how I personally have seen generational trauma passed down from Emily to Lorelai to Rory, and how I think that this affected their development and their character development, their personalities as characters as well. And I just really love the chemistry in this show. Is really incredible, and the way the actors are able to do the acting and the quick talking, it's Gilmore Girls had a very, very specific, quirky style, which I think is thanks to the creator, Amy Sherman Palladino. I just feel like she was the one who gave the Gilmore Girls spirit to the Gilmore show, because there's nothing that's ever been like it, and I don't think there's anything that's ever going to be like it. There are some problematic themes when it comes to Gilmore Girls, especially around the language that is used, but we chalk it up to its time. Let's talk about Emily Gilmore, because she was a very fascinating character for me. One of the things that I love about Emily Gilmore is basically that she's a very contradictory character. The Gilmore family was like one of the biggest families in high society in Connecticut. I don't know how to say this word, please, I'm Kenyan. If I read it, it's Connecticut, so I don't understand why Americans say Connecticut, because that just doesn't make sense to me. So please forgive me, I'm going to butcher it so badly. But it is my Kenyan tongue. I can't do anything about it. So in the high society of Connecticut, the Gilmores were one of those really big families. And I remember there was an episode where Rory was talking to Logan about the fact that his family, Logan was her boyfriend from about season 5. They started getting involved in season 6 and 7. They were in a relationship. And with Logan's family was like, they're called the Hansburgers, and I'm trying to imagine what well-known family could be compared to them. I guess maybe something like the Hiltons, maybe the Rockefellers, like this really old money type of family. And the dad owned, like, it was this empire of newspapers, like all over the country, and so Rory was dating Logan, and his family was not really welcoming to her, and it was partly because of the fact that Rory came from a single mother. Even if there was the Gilmore name, it was just like, still, your origins are not very good, when it comes to like the society that we belong to. So she made this comment that her family came on the Mayflower, and I had to do a little bit of research. To be honest, I didn't read that much, but I did a bit of research about the Mayflower, and the Mayflower was one of the biggest ships that came from Europe, and was delivering a whole bunch of Anglo-Saxons mainly from Britain, and taking them to the New World or the Americas or America, modern day USA. And so these families, some of them were actually pretty wealthy families. It was a mix of different people, but a lot of what would become like the high society in America they came from Europe on the Mayflower, and that's how they landed. And they did land around, I believe it was around the Boston area, and then were able now to spread into the United States, or what would become the United States. And one of the biggest places that they settled was actually around the area of Connecticut. So that's why when Rory is talking about her family, she talks about them like, but we came over on the Mayflower, because these were the families that were like the pioneers, and they, like, the things that they survived to be able to actually make that society were really, really bad things. It wasn't a glamorous move. There was the country at that point, the country at that point was still very underdeveloped. These were people who are basically starting from scratch, and there were sicknesses on the boat. And then when they landed on American soil, there were also a lot of like different diseases that they had to deal with. There was a very big drought. And so these were people who, when they say like the American spirit, and sometimes Americans like to talk about like this spirit of like it's indomitable, like they can do anything. These were some of the pioneers of that spirit, because they weathered, and I believe that when they came onto the land, it was actually during winter. So they braved winter without really anything much. And so the families that survived that, really, like, there was this just a mentality of like, almost like we're kind of superhuman. We're not like everybody else. And so that's why when these societies formed, there was this idea of like, we have to keep things kind of pure, because the stock that we are made from is not like anybody else. We set up this country, we were able to create a lot of wealth, and at the same time, the things that we survived. And so there's a lot of intermarrying that happens in this society. I don't know how it is now in the present day, but even during the time of Gilmore Girls, especially like, those seasons, there was still this mentality of we have to keep it within the society, which is why it was so important for families to marry, like the families that belong to these societies, to marry each other. Sometimes there was actually intermarrying within the family. And I remember that there was this episode where Lorelai's grandma passed away, and Lorelai was helping Emily do like, sort through her grandmother's things, and she found some documentation that showed that there were actually, I believe, first cousins that intermarried within the Gilmore line also. And she made these hilarious jokes about like, incest. It's not a really good topic, but at the same time, it was really funny how she talked about it. So with that, you're able to see that the society that Emily grew up in, there were very specific and very high standards for how you conducted yourself, the way that you were supposed to marry, what marriage meant, and also how you carry yourself as a woman. And we see that personified in Emily. But she's a bit of a contradiction, because as much as she does play the role of the supportive wife, she's there. She's like the society wife. She creates a beautiful home for Richard, which is her husband, and at the same time, she's always there supporting him. He's the breadwinner, so he goes and works. And by the way, for families like the Gilmores, it wasn't necessary for them to work because they had generational wealth. These were people who had like billions probably of dollars that had been passed on, and Richard probably had his own trust fund, and he had already set up a trust fund for Lorelai, although she fell out of grace and she wouldn't even have accepted it. And at some point in the series is even a discussion about Rory's trust fund as well. So these are people who had money and didn't need to work, but because of that set of values that came from that whole survival spirit, they still maintained that they had to be functional and productive contributors to the society. And so Emily personifies that in being a supportive wife. She creates a beautiful home, she manages his social diary, and also she sits on so many boards, because one of the things that a wife of a man in this society is supposed to do is, now she's the one who builds the social capital, while he builds the economic capital of the family and continues that wealth. She builds the social capital. And so there's a lot of reference in the whole series to committees and teas and, banquets and functions that Emily does in the name of charity. And we even see that Rory at some points gets pulled into those things and becomes involved. And you can see that for her, that value system is so important. And I'm already getting so in-depth into her character, because although I really want to do a very deep dive into her, but for the purposes of this video, and I have to tell myself, because I can get carried away, let's not talk too much about Emily's background, because we'll talk about that. But when it pertains to generational trauma, this is how I feel it manifests, or this is what I witnessed it manifesting with Emily throughout the series. Because of this whole strict set of expectations that probably are socialized into you and conditioned into you from the time you're a child, Emily had very strict ideas about what a woman's place is. And it was, you support your husband, you carry yourself in a dignified way, and you obviously have to get married to someone who's of the same society. And she was very strict in looking at Lorelai's men and comparing them, sometimes to her own detriment, and sometimes to the detriment of her relationship with Lorelai. In some ways, really affecting Lorelai's dating life in a very negative way. But she had this idea that a woman was supposed to fulfill this particular role, and she really tried to enforce this same conditioning on Lorelai. With Emily, you still see a contradiction in her, because as much as she does play this role really well, she still also has a very stubborn streak that can sometimes even feel like it's overbearing, even to her husband. So sometimes she is the more dominant one in the relationship, and she's the one who's stating what needs to happen. And so as much as she does fit this role, there are aspects of her that are still in rebellion to that role. And that's probably what she passed on to Lorelai. I don't know if personality traits are really passed on from parent to child. I do think to some extent. And so how I saw the relationship was, Lorelai's relationship with Emily was always very contentious. But I feel like part of that contention was the fact that that Emily was confronting in Lorelai an aspect of herself. And that was the rebellious part of her. And if you look at Emily's personality throughout the whole show, you can see that she's actually quite rebellious and knows her own mind, and she's very strong-willed. And I can just imagine if we were able to see a prequel of Emily's childhood, was she also just as rebellious as Lorelai? But because of the strength of the societal conditioning at that point, there was no option for her to even be able to express these sides of herself. By the time Lorelai was a teenager, this was in the 80s, and you can imagine at that point, the world had really changed. This was post-hippie phase, and so as much as Emily in the home was very controlling on, probably, we've seen glimpses of that on what Lorelai does and what she consumes and how she behaves. She's still interacting with people in the outside world, in school. There's still like TV that she's watching, things that Emily probably didn't have at the time in the same way. And so there was still some cultural things that were probably influencing Lorelai beyond just her mother. I imagine the background story of Emily, and I'm just like, this was definitely a part of herself that she had to hide, that she had to suppress, that she had to, just put in and not allow expression of. And then Lorelai comes along and is this very rebellious child. And so sometimes when it comes to judgment, the harshest judgment that we have on other people is because we are witnessing something that is inside of us. And I do believe that this is now the generational trauma that Emily was passing down to Lorelai. Because in this society that they belong to, individuality is not really encouraged. Roles and rigid roles are that were what mattered. So we can see that there was a lot of conflict between Lorelai and Emily in terms of the fact that Lorelai could not fit into this mold. And at the same time, the fact that Lorelai got pregnant at 16 was like salt in the wound of an already very painful relationship, because now it was the ultimate shame that could be brought upon a family at the time. It was almost like a signal to the rest of the society that Emily had not done her job as a mother. This early pregnancy or teen pregnancy situation with Lorelai was actually quite traumatic for Emily as well. So the other way that Emily impacts Lorelai is the lack of acceptance of who she is. And this is also tied into the strict expectations for the role that she was supposed to fit into, right? There's just this rejection of parts of Lorelai, almost like she doesn't want to see these parts, she doesn't want to engage with them. She's constantly calling Lorelai out. And we see this happen so many times whenever they have conflict. Lorelai does not feel safe in her relationship with Emily, and that ends up really being a very destructive thing. If you have ever felt rejection, you know how painful rejection can be. And sometimes, we think about trauma as these like really, really big things. And of course, big things do lead to trauma. So, we think of things like abuse, we think of things as violence, poverty is also a trauma. Those are things that we think about, but rejection of you at a fundamental level is also a very traumatic thing. And it's something that can create such lasting effects in a person that can hit, your sense of self, your identity, the value that you put on yourself, your ability to move in the world. Like, there's so many things that are impacted by a rejection. And Lorelai faced rejection for who she was from the very beginning. Because I remember there was an episode when Emily was telling a story about Lorelai having an ear infection and crying, and the way she told it was like, even just that, like, why would a child be crying over an ear infection? It wasn't like, put in a compassionate way where you could see that Emily understood that her child was in pain and this was why she was crying. It was almost like, this annoying child crying because she has an infection, which is funny when you watch it, but when you really think about it, isn't that just a little bit crazy that even just expressing pain is not allowed? There are a lot of ways that children will react to such conditioning, forced conditioning, or rejection of who they are. Sometimes it can break the spirit of a child and they become compliant, but in a way that really destroys them, in a very destructive way. And another way that a child could react is just full-on rebellion to the system completely. And sometimes it's weird because the rebellion can be a really good thing, but there's also the fact that it can be detrimental because this creates a lack of belonging to the society that the child was born into. So as much as, sometimes you'll see these people who really rebelled against their families of origin, and in some ways I've done that. I'm sure all of us, there's a bit of rebellion for most of us, at the very least, that we've had against the family, or at least the structures and the values and the norms that we came from. But the thing about being like the black sheep is that it can be an incredibly lonely experience, and you sort of find yourself having to move away from the home. Literally, sometimes it's mentally, sometimes it's emotionally, sometimes it's psychologically. Other times, for a lot of black sheep, it is literally moving away from the home situation. And we see that that's what happened to Lorelai when she got pregnant at 16. Very quickly, her parents were trying to fix the situation, they already moved very quickly into pushing Lorelai into the role that she was already being conditioned for. So by that, they tried to get her to marry Rory's father, and they were going to even get him working at Richard's company, and they're going to set them up in a way that they could start being a family from 16 years old. You can imagine. And Lorelai really rebelled against this, and she was just like, I'm not going to do this. She didn't want to saddle herself with a marriage at that point. She had the awareness to know that she was too young to be on this path. And at the same time, she didn't want to limit the potential of Rory's father, even if I do think for him, maybe the marriage would have been a stabilizing factor. But for her, I believe it would have been too stifling. Maybe within the first year of Rory's life, she just packed up what she could and found her way to Stars Hollow and started an entirely new life. And if you think about it, 16 years old, I mean, there are people all over the world who, because of neglect or because of loss of parents, because of a lack of a family, because of being orphaned, there's so many reasons that people can end up on their own at a very young age. And this situation is not something. I worked for an organization that was supporting women from the informal settlements in Nairobi. And this is not an unheard of case where a mother, a teenager, has a child at a very young age and is forced into motherhood and adulthood for all intents and purposes very quickly. And so Lorelai just had to figure out a life for herself, and she became this very hyper-independent person. And sometimes that happens when you experience neglect as a child or you're forced into adult situations very quickly, you end up becoming hyper-independent. This can also happen because of rejection, because now you figure, I can't rely on anybody in my family circle. I am rejected. I'm cast out. So I have to only rely on myself. And hyper-independence is one of those things that can look really good in some ways, but can also impact your relationships in very negative ways, because like it or not, the relationships that we form as humans are meant to be interdependent. We're meant to rely on each other. And so if you have hyper-independence, you are robbing yourself of a thing that connects people. Think about when one of your loved ones has gone through a difficult time and you have been able to be there for them. What did that feel like for you, especially if it wasn't like a situation where you felt taken advantage of, or like this person was just overly dependent on you? When you were able to step in and be there for someone that you really cared about, and you were able to do it in a way that felt good, didn't that strengthen your bond with that person? So that's what we're supposed to do for each other. This is something that is fundamental when it comes to human relationships. So when you're hyper-independent, you're pushing away a connection that is supposed to be there. And it doesn't mean that now, the thing that I've noticed about hyper-independent people, and I have elements of that, but not quite. But with hyper-independent people, it's almost like even a little bit of dependence, even just asking for help, just feels like you become the heaviest burden on this planet. And you feel like now the person you're asking for help is like, ugh, this person is too much, hyper-independent people tend to be so sensitive when it comes to receiving support, which, yes, that it just doesn't work in relationships. It makes the other person feel like you don't need them. And there is something within us that loves to feel needed in a healthy way, obviously, in a balanced way. Lorelai really developed very quickly in some specific ways because she had to figure out how her and Rory were going to live, eat. She had to be the provider. She had to provide the structure for the family as well. And so when we meet Lorelai at 32, she already is managing an inn, she's running an inn. And, she owns her own home, and she's very responsible when it comes to the financial aspect of providing for her family. But there are other aspects of Lorelai that are so stunted. And again, this is something that happens when a child does not have the opportunity to go through their entire childhood fully. And that childhood is either interrupted by expectations or by traumatic events, then you see that in some ways a child might be stunted. When we meet Lorelai, she's 32 years old, but she listens to music like a teenager. She even talks. There's a way that she can talk sometimes that feels almost like you're dealing with a twin or a teenager. It's kind of juvenile. Her tastes can also be particularly juvenile. In the very first episode, she has like these lip glosses that at the time, just there was a time when lip gloss was a thing, it was a thing. It's always been a thing. But it was just like those lip gloss with like sparkles. Sometimes it had stars, and it was just this thing. Late 90s, early 2000s. It was such a thing, and there were flavored ones, and it was a very girly, lovely thing. Shout magazine sometimes used to even have samples of lip gloss. So that's just some serious nostalgia. Anyway, so now when it comes to Lorelai, you see that even in the way that she eats like a teenager. Like, she's into candy and, fast food, and will very rarely eat fruits and vegetables. She doesn't eat like an adult. Their eating habits are also something that are central to the show, her and Rory, because it's a marvel that they eat the way that they eat and they still stay skinny, but like their eating habits are terrible, like really, really bad, like really, really bad. So much fast food, so much processed stuff, very little real anything. And that's one of the unrealistic things about, there are people who have fast metabolisms, but is it really realistic that somebody would be able to eat junk food every single day for years and still just remain so nice and trim? It's impossible. And then they also, one of the central things is also like a coffee addiction, which I read once that they got so tired of coffee, specifically the actress who plays Rory, got so tired of coffee within the first season that I think she would drink flat Coke because she just couldn't. She was just like, ugh, every day they're shooting. Can you imagine how many hours that is of like taking coffee. So I do know that it was either colored water or like flat Coke was what she substituted for the coffee. And then also when it comes to relationships, there's an aspect of her in relationships that can feel very childlike. She just hasn't figured out a way to be able to be emotionally secure in romantic relationships. And so she sabotages pretty much every relationship that she's in. But that is also one of the manifestations. So you can see very quickly developed in a particular area in her life, very focused, very stable, very driven, but then very stunted. And now when it comes to what Lorelai passed on to Rory in terms of generational trauma, from my observation, what I saw was that Lorelai parentified Rory in the aspects that she was stunted in. So financial aspects, we've talked about that. She's very far ahead. But when it came to the emotional needs and the structure in terms of just like managing things, especially in the home setting. And it's interesting that she could be so responsible at work, but at home it felt like she just was just like, and maybe that's also part of the rebellion of having to take on so much responsibility at a young age. Rory had to take on a lot of the emotional labor and emotional stability in the family. And so when we meet Rory, she's a very mature, especially like the first few episodes, you still see like their teenage aspects that she can't run away from. But generally, up until maybe season 6, when she goes through her own rebellious phase, we see that Rory carries herself with this maturity that is almost like a 30-year-old. So she has taken on the parentified role in that aspect. She's the voice of reason a lot of times for Lorelai, talking her down, calming her down from her tantrum. It was almost like Rory was settled into a person before she had time to grow into a person. There have been several references that Lorelai made throughout the season about how Rory raised herself, or like Rory is good, she doesn't need to be raised, she came out done. No, she didn't. And we see that very clearly as we watch Rory, even in the revival, especially in the revival, we get to see that there are certain aspects that have not developed in Rory, and she has some really big gaps that don't become clear until she has to face the realities of life. But this is because she had to take on so much responsibility at such a young age. And it's not just Lorelai's stuntedness in certain aspects, because also Rory's father was not particularly steady for a lot of her life. First few seasons, we see him be this guy who was sort of like aimless, like, you know, he would start this business and he would have this job, and he never could stay stable for a good period of time. He also was in and out of Rory's life, didn't really have a structured way of relating with her. He wasn't a frequent presence. He often neglected her, and I think part of it was resentment over not ending up with Lorelai, because to him that was his soulmate. And even though they did end up together, it feels like by the time he was now coming into stability, it had been too late. The damage was already done. He hadn't showed up for Rory in the way that she needed. So it was almost like there was no real space for him in her life. He did not really provide fatherly guidance to Rory. So Rory really had to rely on herself to be her own voice of reason, until she got to a place where now she rebelled, which makes sense completely. And we'll get into that when I do the deep dive for Rory, because there are just so many interesting themes when it comes to the way that Rory behaved. It was almost like she was protagonist, antagonist in one. You know, I love characters like that, because it's just such a rich and layered way to write a character, where you see these complex things. It just creates this nice tension with a character where you sometimes you don't know, do I like this person, do I not like this person, because sometimes they're really amazing, other times they're just like, ugh. And isn't that the reality of being human? So many of us are like that. We're so amazing in so many ways and we suck in other ways. The other way that generational trauma showed up in Rory, which is also tied into the parentification, is being this golden child. The way that Lorelai and her parents would talk about Rory, you would think she was the Messiah, like the second coming of Jesus, because she was just this amazing person who never did anything wrong and was so like smart, and things came so easily to her. She did work hard in terms of like studying for school, but typically, like when you look at Rory, like things were just, it seemed like everything just came. She was just like naturally good at everything. And that sometimes can be a trauma response. There was not too much that Lorelai needed to do to guide Rory to become a functional person, because it was almost like she would just do it herself. So I can see how that would also become a point of pain eventually, but at the time when Rory is a child, she probably did it as a way to also make Lorelai happy, or to give Lorelai some sense of fulfillment, because children can really feel that. Sometimes a child, not sometimes, many times, if not all the time, children will be able to read the mental and emotional state of their parents. And so if they're able to do something that can create some kind of fulfillment or some kind of joy or some kind of, you know, boost in their parents, and this is something that I even witnessed with myself when it came to one of my parents, you find that a child might perform so that they can, you know, be the good child, and this can make their parent feel good or feel better. That fell apart, obviously, because it wasn't built on real, like, development of her as a person. It was built on a performance. And when anything is built on a performance, especially a performance to get validation or to feel a sense of belonging, then at some point in your life, it's going to fall apart. And that's what happens with Rory. So when it comes to the revival, there was a lot of character development that happened. And we saw that with the different characters, for better or for worse. There were some characters that, for me, the growth that we saw into the revival was just like perfection, like chef's kiss. And there were some that were so annoying, like it's like, oh. And for me, the annoying character in the revival was Rory. But the reason why it was so annoying, I think, was because it was so well written. Because the truth of the Golden Child is, especially because it's mostly built on, like I said, this performance for validation, then at some point they crash and they fall apart, and this is what happened with Rory, and she just was not able to stand on her own. She wasn't able to be independent, and this is something that has happened. Hey, I've been in that boat so many times in my life. We see Rory struggle with things like building resilience, being able to meet challenges, and she's in a relationship that is just not going anywhere, and at the same time cheating and having an affair with somebody that she was in love with. We'll do a whole deep dive on Rory from season 1 all the way to the revival, but just to say that her generational trauma, by the time we see her in the revival, I believe that this is when she goes through the thick of it. The way that I have interacted with trauma, and this is with clients when I'm doing my coaching or even just personally, is that there's always a point of reckoning. That's the thing with trauma. It can lay dormant for the longest time, and you'll not be able to, like, maybe you'll see signs, but then they won't be overt signs, but then there'll be a time when it will make itself known and you have to face that trauma. And we see that that's the point that Rory is at when we see her in the revival, because now her life is just not working, her career is not working, her romantic life is not working, her finances are not working, like nothing is working. That's the point when Rory has to just like really sit down and face herself. I was like, I get it, because it's her point of reckoning. I don't know if they'll do another revival, but maybe by that point now we'll be able to get to see a more mature version of Rory, where now she's gone through dealing with the trauma that she experienced and has been able now to, to become a more mature and I guess developed, more evolved version of herself. But my favorite character development was Emily Gilmore. That was my favorite one, because we get to see, remember when I talked about the rebellious part of Emily that she probably had to suppress because she had this role that was so important for her to fill? We really get to see what Emily is like with the constraints of the society thrown off of her, because it happens in a very painful way, because her husband Richard passes on and now she has to navigate life by herself, and this was one of the most central, this was the central relationship for her. It was her anchor. She built her world around being Richard's wife, and so now without him she has to stand on her own, and rather than fall apart, she does fall apart, but she falls apart to fall together. And I can't wait to do a deep dive into that, because her character growth is so delicious. It's so tasty that I'm just like, whoever wrote that, it made me so happy. She ends up being herself. So that is my, I don't know what to call it. Is it an essay? Is it a synopsis? Is it a review? I don't know. But that's my breakdown of the generational trauma that we see in Gilmore Girls. With Gilmore Girls, there are also so many other characters that I can talk about, because there's the men of Lorelai, there's like the friendships, Suki, and there's the quirkiness of the town. I don't know how far this will go, but I'm excited to be here. Please feel free to share any thoughts that you have in the comment section. I'd really love to connect with you guys and look for more content like this. Let me know what you think about this content, because this is stuff that I love to do. It's something that I do in my free time, and so being able to do it on this platform is also very exciting. Otherwise, please remember, above everybody else, you deserve your own unconditional love and acceptance, and I will see you in the next video.